When Roland Barthes wrote his essay in 1967, he wasn't talking about literal death, but a figurative separation of the author from their written work. But it often gets misused. Let's look at what it all means, and I'll try not to fall into the same fallacy. The death of the author. Where have you heard this before? Well, most recently it's been used to absolve a certain British author from the flagrant bigotry etched into the seams of their stories. But aside from J.K. Rowling, or Robert Galbraith, or whatever male pseudonym they decide to use for whatever book series they may happen to be writing at the time, it's also been used to excuse a ton of problematic and downright offensive authors, from Piers Anthony to Lovecraft, Neil Gaiman, and even J.R.R. Tolkien. I know that last one threw some of you a curveball, but we'll get there. Hold on, buckle up, because somebody's going to hate me for this. So first off, why are people pissed at these authors? Some of the reasons are way more obvious, while others require some digging. First, Neil Gaiman. I feel really bad because I know I've personally gone on to speak his praises, but recently he's been accused of some truly heinous sexual misconduct by some female associates, and if I got into the details of it, this entire video would have to be age-restricted. Suffice it to say, books like American Gods, Good Omens, and even Coraline, stories that were beloved until recently, have seen a huge hit in popularity because of Gaiman's actions. But it's not like any of these stories contain any of these gross adult themes. No, but Piers Anthony. Oh, gods. Personally, I liked the Incarnations of Immortality series, especially On a Pale Horse, a story about a man who kills death and becomes the Grim Reaper. But then there's Firefly, called a novel of ecstatic horror. It's less horrifying and more just vulgar. First we have desiccated dead bodies that somehow spread some kind of pheromone that turns people on when they get too close to corpses. We've got some really bad autistic representation in the character Geode, as well as some homophobia when Geode discovers the body of a dead man, gets aroused, and is more repulsed because he's not a homosexual than the rotting dead body that he found. Then we have the self-described nymphomaniac character with a rape fetish, and somewhere between 4 to 5 pages of a little girl going into dramatic detail about the sexual abuse she endured, which wouldn't be a huge red flag if it wasn't something that ultimately described, even by the victim, as a game. I'll be honest, I couldn't finish this book. It made me sick. Not in a horror way, but in a way that made me hideously uncomfortable. Piers Anthony has been called out for these depictions before, but actually doubled down on it because of some kind of edgy artistic expression. Look, at least George R.R. Martin always frames it as a bad thing. Now finish the damn story, we're all waiting! Still a better dragon tale than Eragon. Fun fact, Tales of Atonement was originally passed for Eragon. I wonder what they'd think now. Anyway. By contrast, we could look at the story Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Nabokov's main character, Humbert, is, by his own definition, a monster. The story of Lolita explores the concept of the unreliable narrator. The story is told from Humbert's perspective as he stalks, grooms, and molests the 12-year-old character named Lolita. We, as the audience, are meant to read Humbert's story from a critical perspective. His thoughts and actions are meant to trick us into seeing him as a hopeless romantic. And for some people, like J.K. Rowling, that seems to have been the case, wherein she called the story a tragic love story. Now there's bad takes, and then there's this. Yikes. But then Rowling has been the subject of her own takedowns in the past, and with good reason. Her demonization of the transgender community has led to real-world harm in the UK and across the world. She is directly responsible for harms relating to her own country because she's actually put forth money into these legislative changes and noted herself that it was part of her long-term plans to attack, discredit, and even destroy 1% of the population. That's to say nothing of the claims of body-shaming, anti-Semitism, racism, and the use of harmful tropes to depict gay men in her series. This isn't just relevant to Harry Potter, though. That's what most people like to focus on. We could also point back to the Silkworm of the Cormoran Strike series. Cormoran Strike is a series written under the pen name Robert Galbraith. Though she denies the connection, this relates to Robert Galbraith Heath, an American psychiatrist who, in 1953, attached electrodes to a gay man's body and electroshock therapied him into showing sexual arousal for a female sex worker. However, Heath's work failed to convert the man's innate sexual interest, and what he did amounted to nothing less than sexual torture. So what is it about the Silkworm that makes it so bad? Well, it's specifically got to do with Rowling's treatment of her character, Pippa Midgley. Pippa is depicted as a trans woman in the story, and how is this communicated to the readers? Through the prominence of her Adam's apple and an ID card that still has her dead name on it. The main character, Cormoran, interrogates Pippa, the conversation escalates, and Cormoran says, "It won't be fun for you inside, Pippa, not pre-op." This is framed as him just stating facts, but let's be real. This is a man threatening a woman with sexual assault unless she complies to his investigation. I can understand a hard-ass, edgy detective, but why the rape threats? And why are all our main characters always men that turn out to be cops? Bartha wrote a lot about symbolisms, even in Death of the Author. The first paragraph, which really threw me for a loop, says, "In his story, Sarracine, Balzac, speaking of a castrato disguised as a woman, writes his sentence, 'It was woman, with her sudden fears, her irrational whims, her instinctive fears, her unprovoked bravado, her daring, and her delicious delicacy of feeling.' Who is speaking in this way? Is it the story's hero, concerned to ignore the castrato concealed beneath the woman? Is it the man, Balzac, endowed by his personal experience with philosophy of woman? Is it the author Balzac professing certain literary ideas of femininity? Is it universal wisdom or romantic psychology? It will always be impossible to know, for the good reason that all writing is itself this special voice consisting of several indiscernible voices, and that literature is precisely the invention of this voice, to which we cannot assign a specific origin. Literature is the neuter, that composite, that oblique, into which every subject escapes, the trap where all identity is lost, beginning with the very identity of the body that writes." So even in the Death of the Author essay from the 50s, mentions an even older story from the mid-1800s where this castrato is probably an old world understanding of a transgender woman. Wait, I thought trans people have just been a thing since 2015. Weird. In the 70s, Bartha also wrote an entire book on Sarracine where he breaks it down blow by blow, dissects the entire text. Could we evaluate this scene from Silkworm in the same way? What is the purpose of denoting Pippa's Adam's apple? Every person has a pharyngeal presence. It's just usually more pronounced in people with higher testosterone. And then there's Strike's threats. Obviously, this dark and gritty detective is probably just an asshole bigot, but given the level of asshole bigotry that J.K. Rowling has become famous for, can this ever be truly divorced and separated from her ideals? We can look at Lovecraft again. Not all of his characterizations of black people or immigrants was so subversive as Innsmouth. Some of his poetry was blatantly racist, and he's noted as being extreme, even for his time. Similarly, J.K. Rowling's tweets about trans people and her portrayal of trans women in her writing mirrors her inner feelings on the trans community, and that is to say that trans women are predators, and that trans men are confused victims. And though I'm not sure you could ever get her to admit it, I feel the same about Voldemort as well. J.K. Rowling has gone on record to say that her Death Eaters are alike to transgender activists, which is turf code for trans people asking for equal human rights, something that the UK is trying very hard to take away, and again, a legislation that she herself funded. But more than that, he has a dead name, Tom Riddle, no relation to Martin or Shane. He's grotesque and deformed, a common caricature of trans people who are usually in the middle stage of their transition process. And his giant evil snake killed a girl in the bathroom, and I think this one speaks for itself. See, often what people like me do when we look at these things through a critical lens, we're using semiology. Semiology was also something Bartha wrote about in his 1957 book, Mythologies. Semiology is the systematic study of sign processes and the communication of meaning. In semiotics, a sign is defined as anything that communicates intentional and unintentional meanings or feelings to the sign's interpreter. It's how we can find Jesus in Buttered Toast or Gnosticism in The Matrix. And honestly, it's been the symbols in those books that people have told her about time and time again, how they're harmful. And not only does she deny and double down, she also mocks the people who voice these complaints. Sort of like Piers Anthony. and Lovecraft. What do we do with writers like this? That's where people have invoked Barta's essay, however incorrectly, as a basis. They'll simply replace the authority over something like Harry Potter with someone who's less contentious, like Daniel Radcliffe or Hatsune Miku. Yes, the Vocaloid. Honestly, an AI probably could have written it better, but we won't get into that. What I will get into is using the things Barta wrote about in order to figure upon my own basis for how we remove authority from the work. And first that begins by looking at the themes, the concepts, and the mythos. In Lovecraft, this means looking at the parts of the lore where his eldritch creations, such as the Deep Ones, and recognizing the harmful intent against immigrants, foreigners, and BIPOC people. Similarly, this is a criticism of Rowling's goblins. From the very first book all the way to the recent video game, there has been a semiology around these beings that harkens back to the harmful tropes about Jewish people. Both Rowling and Lovecraft used harmful tropes. Neither of them ever apologized or backed down. Lovecraft's use of the name Abdul al-Hazared as the author of the Necronomicon has been deemed offensive as an Arabic name due to the lack of structure that follows traditional Arabian nomenclature. Also, Rowling has been criticized for names like Cho Chang, a combination of two different surnames that doesn't follow Chinese nomenclature, as well as the name of a black wizard, Kingsley Shacklebolt. Lovecraft often misused concepts from non-white cultures, noting them as primitive or dirty. In many ways, especially when using skinwalkers in her American lore, she misused native culture stories around this, and mocked people who called her out on it. To his credit, I suppose when Lovecraft learned that Hitler was actually doing a genocide over in Germany, at least he didn't start throwing money behind him. That's a step up from J.K. Rowling calling the 1933 burning of the Sexology Institute, which resulted in the destruction of Magnus Hirschfeld's body of work into transgender science as a fever dream, and denying that trans people were ever victims during the Holocaust. By the way, many queer people, including gay men, never got out of those camps, even after the Allied forces ended Hitler's regime. They either remained there or were moved into prisons. But I mentioned one author in here that, for any of his shortcomings, didn't seem to do so maliciously. That's J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, a lot of you might be thinking that I'm having a fever dream, but actually no. The controversy around Tolkien is less pronounced and speaks to a broader narrative about how we view fiction today versus how they viewed fiction during his time. The criticism of Tolkien breaks down into how pale or fair-skinned races in the people of Middle-earth were often aligned with good, and dark or black-skinned people were aligned with evil. This isn't just limited to the Uruk-hai, but also the Haradrim and the Easterlings. And it's likely that since stories like Lord of the Rings have informed Rowling's Harry Potter series, and that she's just ported over his goblins but made them slightly more civilized or something, maybe she'd prefer well-assimilated, as Lovecraft did. But where Tolkien differs from Rowling is substantial. Tolkien heard the criticisms of his work during his lifetime. He reflected on this and began to frame things a different way. Tolkien actively acknowledged that he wished he had more time to flesh out these races, and he was doing so until his death in 1973. He claimed that the Haradrim and the Easterlings were not evil, but they were being commanded and misguided by individuals like Saruman and Sauron, pale, fair-haired men that were corrupted by greed and influence. Saruman used the bitterness that the orcs felt at being othered away from the elves and cast aside by men to turn it into a burning hatred that turned them into warriors and bloodthirsty madmen. Tolkien's orcs have informed everything about them since their inception, and this reputation has followed the race across Warcraft, Warhammer, Dungeons & Dragons, and yes, Harry Potter. But that obviously wasn't Tolkien's intent. Does it matter? According to Barta, not really. If people want to make a race that is inherently evil, it's entirely up to them, but ultimately I think it speaks more of someone who can only see evil and good as inherent traits of a group of people, and not the range of nuance that all groups have. There are people who are bigots only because they've fallen in the ideology of someone they see as an authority, but there are also those who revel in the pain they cause. Now that's why I think another author who did it right is K.A. Applegate. Applegate wrote the Animorphs novels, as well as a few other series, and every one of her characters has this nuanced persona. Yeerks, Hork-Bajir, Taxons, none of them have an inherently good or evil quality. Some Yeerks don't want to take unwilling hosts, most Hork-Bajir would rather just be climbing trees, and all Taxxons get sick and tired of being ravenous cannibals. Even though it's supposed to be part of their nature, the species itself grew to reject this notion. Pacifists see the world at war and can't not act. The Andalites are meant to be seen as galactic heroes, at least to themselves, but end up coming across arrogant, pompous, and even younger ones like Axe are forced to evaluate past bigotry when it comes to his own kind. And these concepts and symbols are baked into the mythos. Some books can't be divorced from these things. The themes, the concept, the mythos become so ingrained that truly the only way to handle the authority at this point becomes to critique, if not straight up mock, the concepts that the author uses. For good examples of this against Harry Potter, you could look at things like The Owl House or Mashal, Might and Magic. Lovecraft? I suggest Lovecraft Country, written by Jordan Peele, who also wrote Get Out, Us, and Nope. It offers a look into the Cthulhu mythos while also addressing racist atrocities of the time that Lovecraft's words and rhetoric, and in fact, many white supremacists, also still prop this up today. Another of the most excellent examples of death of the author would absolutely have to be Starship Troopers. When I say that, we're taking from the author Robert Heinlein. To his credit, Heinlein was among the first to emphasize scientific accuracy in his fiction, and was thus credited as a pioneer of hard science fiction genre. But for Starship Troopers, one of the biggest critiques of this work is how it tried to function as a full-on military propaganda piece. No, really, film director Paul Verhoeven designed his movie to be satire, while Heinlein was actually trying to be serious about it. Would you like to know more? The Cavernacle did a good takedown of Starship Troopers, and I'll link that for your convenience. Something else that deals with the hard sci-fi, and even has a reference to Starship Troopers, is Mass Effect, especially when we look at the Rachni. The Rachni are giant insect aliens that serve as enemies in the series. In Mass Effect lore, there was a huge war around their attack on the galaxy, and the only way the Council races survived was to conscript an entire race of beings, the Krogan, which they later discluded from political power and subjugated under a eugenics program called the Genophage. Oh, the bugs though? Through certain character choices, we learned that the reason the Rachni attacked is due to a signal from deep space, the sound of which drove their queen insane. Have you guys ever seen what happens to bees when the queen gets separated? Is it the bees' fault? Mass Effect and the Starship Troopers film do what Heinlein fails to do: critique the use of genocide within an intelligent species simply because of its appearance in comparison to humans. It's, again, the same notion as Lovecraft and Rowling, and even early Tolkien. Pretty equals good, and ugly equals bad. These old tropes deserve to be called out, challenged, and even destroyed if necessary for progress to be made, and the irrational notions behind these authors' feelings and thoughts can be bisected from their work. This one got a little more raw and real than how I usually do these. I try to stick to a formula and a script, but I just wanted to, be kinda open. It might get me demonetized, and I don't know how well to do, but if you got to this point, please consider subscribing. Did I get something wrong, or did I just annoy you for speaking out? If that's the case, go ahead and tell me to fuck off, but it won't really matter since I don't fancy a shag. Patreon is our main hub for all things involved with Tales of Atonement, and our patron support helps us produce our episodes faster and with more consistency. But what's in it for you? From there you can find our Tales of Atonement Discord server, art, music, comics, as well as exclusive viewership for upcoming scripts. Supporting us on Patreon is what shows us we're part of a growing community of artists, actors, history buffs, and storytellers that have become fascinated with our characters these past couple of years. This is our passion project we've put our hearts and souls into over 20 years, and your support really helps keep that flame alive. Right now, a big thanks to Pammy Poo, Heinrich28, Shadow Fox, Charles Tam, Arya Gamari, Jace Morland, and Lunder Lumen. And of course, everyone who joins us each week. At the very least, I hope you'll like this video, subscribe, and ring my bell if it really resonated with you. And I'll see you again next week. Many a Mickle, Maximukle.